Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Age Group Triathlon podcast. My name is Simon Olney. I'm a professional triathlon coach, and I've started this podcast for the 99% of triathletes who aren't looking to turn pro, break world records, or spend 20 hours a week training. Now, I'm afraid I don't have an expensive microphone or a fancy jingle, but I hope to use this podcast to share coaching advice and interview athletes just like you, to hear about their experiences racing, understand what makes them tick, and share some real world actionable advice to help you race fast at your next event. Hello everyone, on today's episode I'm going to be looking at a little bit of triathlon myth busting. So I'm going to take a few sort of misconceptions that people have that they tend to pick up from social media most frequently, as well as their training partners. And I'm going to try and have a look at them in depth, okay? Because I feel that a lot of people are very trusting of others and the result can be quite devastating to their triathlon performance. So what we're going to be looking at, the subjects are, we're going to be looking at how much you need to kick in the swim, how body weight affects triathlon performance, whether an expensive bike is going to make you that much faster, whether strength training is going to make you really big and muscular, and we're also going to be looking at the amount of salt that you need on race day. So if any of those interest you, let's get cracking. So the first one we're going to look at is how much you need to kick in the triathlon swim. Now, an awful lot of people will tell you that you don't need to kick in the triathlon swim, which I think is pretty bad advice. So to try and explain the reasoning behind it and why it so often comes up, we're going to go all the way back to swimming lessons as children. Now, I worked as a swimming teacher for a few years, and when we get a child in the water, we would teach them to kick before we teach them to use their arms. And there are a few reasons for this. One of them is that a child's legs are much stronger than their arms proportionally. Also, the arm motion takes an awful lot more in the way of sort of skill and focus. They need to put their face in the water. We can just give them a float and ask them to kick their legs. And they will start moving up and down the little learning pool. And if you go to watch swimming lessons, you'll see most children spend an awful lot of time more focused on their kick than they do on their arms. Now, when we get them more experience, we'll add in the arms. But realistically, they're not doing an awful lot of the arms. We're just trying to teach them that motion. However, if a parent who's paying for swimming lessons watches their child kick and move up and down the pool with their arms flailing around like a windmill, they go, oh look, my child can swim, and they pull them out of swimming lessons. But the issue with this is that when that child grows up and decides that they want to start triathlon, that they will then start swimming, get in the pool, and they will be incredibly kick heavy with their stroke, and they kick really hard. They may well even have their head out of the water as they swim along, their arms spin around, not really doing very much. And if they manage to make it to the end of the length, they'll be utterly exhausted, and they'll say, how on earth am I going to be able to swim the distance on race day? So understandably, they go and they seek the advice of someone. Could be another swimmer, could be a coach. There are all sorts of people out there who are more than willing to offer swim advice. And the advice that many who already compete in triathlon will be is, oh, you don't need to worry about your legs, in the swim. You need to save your legs for the bike, save your legs for the run, okay? You'll have a wetsuit. The wetsuit provides an awful lot of buoyancy, and that will lift your legs up nice and high in the water, so you don't need to worry about kicking, you should focus on your arms. But there are a lot of problems with this. One of them, which is that our leg muscles, our quads, our hamstrings, even looking at our hip flexors and the like, they're very big muscles. They need a lot of oxygen for us to use them. So as we are kicking our legs, we're using an awful more oxygen than we really sort of need to. And the propulsion they provide really is very limited. There are some fantastic swimmers out there who can kick probably faster than I can swim freestyle. And for them, it's relatively effortless. But these are people who are professional swimmers. Well, not professional, but elite level swimmers. And we shouldn't necessarily be looking to emulate them. And chances are the kick that we're using in the water, if we haven't been swimming for a long time, the kick may well be coming from our knees rather than from our hips. Our toes may not well be pointed. In fact, they're probably not pointed. They may well have been pointed behind us when we were children, but we've lost that flexibility around our calf and our ankle. So there's a good chance that our toes are going to be pointed towards the bottom of the pool like anchors, and the kick becomes really counterproductive. And the reason for this is that we're trying to use the kick for propulsion. And the kick should never really generate much more than sort of 10-15% to your actual propulsion. Most of the propulsion should come from our upper body. So what are the legs for? Well, the legs are really important for two main reasons. First of all, is to keep your legs high in the water. All your triathlon kick needs to do, and write this down, all your triathlon kick really needs to do is keep your feet gently breaking the surface of the water. Okay, we want to have our legs high in the water so that our legs aren't sinking. If we have sinky legs, that creates a load of drag, and that is going to really slow us down massively in the water. We'll be swimming with our legs underwater, and that is going to cause all sorts of resistance. It's like cycling while stood bolt upright with an open coat flapping in the wind. Most of us would look at that and go, oh, that's so inefficient. Well, with swimming, that's the same reason. We want our legs to be nice and high in the water. Now, if you have a wetsuit that has 5mm of neoprene in the legs, which many of those out there do, targeted at newer swimmers, or even some elite swimmers, then that is going to lift your legs up nicely to the top of the water. But I still don't recommend that you stop kicking altogether, because there are other reasons to do it. One main reason that I think you'll be relatively convinced by is it stops you from getting swum over and kicked and whacked in the swim. If I'm swimming along in open water, like anyone else, I don't have a fantastic level of visibility. As I'm swimming along, I'll be looking down into what's often sort of murky depths. If it's in the sea, it might be a lot clearer. But if I'm swimming in a body of fresh water, there's a good chance I can't see an enormous amount of what's in front of me. Now, if you add into that somebody wearing a black wetsuit, the chance of me being able to see a swimmer in front of me are relatively low. And no matter how far forward I start in a triathlon, there's always somebody slower than me ahead who either thinks they sort of falsely think that the further forward they start, the more time they'll have to complete the event. That's not how it works. It's actually the time that's taken from when you cross the start line rather than when the gun goes off that cut-offs are dictated by. Or they just completely misjudge their ability. And I come right up behind someone and I don't know that they're there until I'm whacking them with my arms. So I normally will hit them, on the feet, on the legs. In some cases, depending on how slowly they're going, especially if it's a lapped course, I may even accidentally come close to to swimming over them. And chances are this swimmer who's moving quite slowly is going to be quite a nervous swimmer, and having me hit them, nearly swim over them, not through any malicious attempt by me, I must point out, simply because I can't see them. Now, if you are kicking your legs in the water, you have that little sort of stream of bubbles behind you, and that lifts your legs nice and high in the water. Now, if I am swimming and I'm approaching you, and I can see a stream of bubbles, I'm going, aha, there's a swimmer ahead. I need to go left or I need to go right, depending on which way it is that I want to go around you. And this is even more important when you're approaching a turn buoy. Now, as you may well be aware, the first turn in a triathlon is often quite a violent place to be. You have hundreds, maybe thousands of athletes who are all bearing down on this single point, and everybody wants to get round that as quickly as they can. And if you are not kicking your legs, you are going to get swum over most likely. So the more that you kick your legs harder as you approach these pinch points in the course, the more visible you'll be, the less likely it is that you are to be able to get swum over by someone. It's something I do myself. You need to have that little bit of extra force in your legs. Now, when we get into this, the exit of the water as well. So as you come into the last kind of 20 meters of the triathlon swim, the ability to start kicking your legs that bit harder to get the blood flowing is really going to help when you stand up. How many people listening to this have ever come out of the open water and felt quite dizzy? I'm going to wager everybody who swim open water has experienced that. And the reason is the blood flow. You go from being horizontal in a cool body of water to suddenly being upright and running, and the blood's flying around the body and it drains from the brain, and we get all these problems. If you're able to kick your legs and get them fired up just within that last kind of 30 seconds, that's really going to help you when you come out of the water. Now, the other reason that we kick our legs in the triathlon swim is because we want to give ourselves a little bit of rhythm to our stroke. So it's just as our legs are tapping away back there, it helps us keep a rhythm with our arms. Now, I'm going to touch here on, you may have heard people talk about a 2-beat, 4-beat, or 6-beat kick. Now, this references the number of kicks you make per arm cycle. So if my right arm enters the water, pushes back behind me, comes out of the water. By the time my right arm re-enters the water, that's what we call a stroke cycle. And we're looking at how many kicks we have per stroke cycle. If you watch the Olympics and you see people swimming the 100 meters freestyle, they're going to be kicking like absolute devils. In fact, probably around 50% of their propulsion may come from their legs, depending on the swimmer. And they will have this 6-beat kick. They'll have 6 beats probably per arm cycle. As we start to look towards marathon swimming, if we start to look at the 10-kilometer swimmers at the Olympics, they may well have closer to a 2-beat kick. So they'll be kicking an awful lot slower because it's just that it's doing, again, coming back to this, the minimum it needs to do, which is providing that little bit of rhythm and helping your ankles break the water. So to wrap up this little section here, a lot of athletes will want to kick very aggressively when they first get into the pool because of the way they're taught, which isn't the way to go. But neither is the way to go to not kick at all, okay? The way that you improve your triathlon swim is by learning to modulate your legs and use them in an efficient way, okay? So don't get drawn into the extremes of kicking loads or not kicking at all. Do some drills, do some swim work to get yourself a nice, comfortable kick that just helps your heels break the surface of the water. The next topic we're going to cover is whether being lighter really does make you faster. So let's look at this one discipline at a time with a quick disclaimer that I weigh just under 60 kilos. So I'm a pretty light athlete. And if weight was everything in sport, I'd be winning everything, which, spoilers, I'm not. But let's start looking at swimming. So if you look at a lot of marathon swimmers, not many of them look like me, has to be said. A lot of them tend to be sort of slightly larger. This is to help them in the colder waters. But also because the weight doesn't actually have an enormous impact on your ability to swim. It may make you a bit more athletic, may make things a little bit more explosive with sort of the diving start that you have in pool swimming. But broadly speaking, if you were to look at a swimmer's training program, weight loss isn't going to be an enormous part of it. Now, the next one is cycling, which is the biggest, let's be honest. So you get a lot of people who want the lightest bike possible, and they want to be as light as possible themselves for the hills. Which, I mean, there is definitely some logic there, but people really overestimate the impact that weight has. Now, if I were to spend about £1,500 on a bike, I'm going to get a really good bike for that money. Or I could spend 10 grand and get a bike that might be a kilo lighter, kilo and a half maybe. Realistically, it doesn't make that much difference. Now, I wrote an article all about this with lots of numbers, which I'm going to link to you in the show notes. But the headline figure is that unless you are really on a steep hill, in a triathlon, weight doesn't actually matter that much. What's far more important than weight is the amount of power that you're putting out. Now, if you look at me, again, very light person, my FTP is never going to be as high as someone whose thighs are the size of my head. Somebody who's just that bit bigger, has that bit more mass, that bit more strength to them, okay? I am never going to have an FTP in the 300s. I can say that with a lot of certainty, because that would put me around the watts per kilo that I would need to win the Tour de France. Whereas you will have a lot of athletes out there who will be able to tick over at sort of the high 200 watts for a 70.3. And if I'm there racing at, say, 220 watts, and somebody comes past me who's, say, 90 kilos, who's putting out 270 watts, how am I going to keep up with them? I simply can't. Now, the fact that I have a smaller frame not only helps on the hills, on the flat, it does give me a slightly more aerodynamic profile, but that does not offset the handicap that I'm facing for being that lighter rider who just can't put out that same raw power. Now, I don't really like to use professional triathletes as an example for things where possible, but if you look at the very best cyclists in the sport, they are not featherweight riders, okay? If you are looking at somebody who has an ability to put out a ridiculously high power for several hours over a really flat, long bike course, okay, you're not going to be looking for someone like me. If we are doing a race such as the Activez Triathlon, okay, I'd fancy my chances there if I'm honest. Because it is steep, it's long, and my power to weight ratio will really come into its own there, and I will be able to do incredibly well. However, there's only really one race I can think of where I'd really excel on the bike. Ironically, despite the fact it's a sport I've been doing the longest, the cycling is actually my least successful sport. I just go backwards because I can't find that raw power. Now, I'm not saying that the more weight that somebody carries, the faster they are going. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm trying to get you to think about is the payoff between weight and raw power. And if you have to make that choice between a restrictive diet that will really affect your ability to recover from exercise and a lowering of muscle mass to help you lose 1 or 2 kilos because you think it's going to make you faster, versus training harder, eating more, better training, always go for the second option, okay? Especially in triathlon. If you're into road cycling, if you want to win a cycling grand tour, that's a very different conversation. But we're triathletes. We are as much about raw power. It's an individual sport. You're not supposed to be drafting people. It's more about the absolute raw power you can put out than it is about how light you are. Now into our final sport. Yes, we are looking at running. And I have to be honest, I'm probably a faster runner than you. In years gone by, I've done 5k in under 18 minutes. I'd like to get back there. But the fact is that if you are a light runner, that is going to make you faster than somebody who is carrying more weight. However, we have to look at a few aspects simply beyond this, okay? Such as obviously the training that you're doing, your resilience to injury, your leg spring stiffness, all of these things. Just because somebody is really light, I mean, I could take somebody who plays World of Warcraft for 18 hours a day, is really malnourished, and I could put them at the start of a half marathon and they would be huffing and puffing before the end of the first kilometre, okay? So light isn't always better, it's always got to come with fitness. But again, we are triathletes. If we are looking at, say, a 70.3 triathlon as an example, and I, due to my lighter frame, run the half marathon, say, a minute faster than somebody else, due to my natural advantage. If I've already lost 5 minutes to them on the bike leg, because their FTP was 30 watts higher than mine, then me being light doesn't really give me a huge advantage. Triathlon is all about balance. It's all about putting together the best triathlon that you can, as opposed to simply putting out the best performance that you can in any individual discipline. So yes, being lighter will help on the bike, on the hills, and it will help on the run, but is far from the be-all and end-all. So if you want to learn a bit more about this, I highly recommend you check out the article that I linked to in the show notes. But the bit I really want to push home is lighter is not always better, okay? Please do not put yourself on restrictive diets. Do everything you can to get into calorific deficit, thinking that getting lighter is the only thing that's going to make you faster, okay? It really isn't. I don't think I've ever had a conversation with one of my athletes about their weight unless they brought it up in the off season saying they'd like to lose a little bit of weight, okay? Fitness outstrips weight every single time. Now, there is a chance that you'll say to me, whoa, hang on, Simon. I've come to triathlon to lose weight. That is my primary goal, not performance. And that's fine, that's a very different conversation. If you have come to the sport from a weight loss perspective, then just by virtue of doing some activity and eating better, that should really help your body composition. What I'm really talking about in this podcast is talking about performance, and I want to avoid people potentially slipping down the route of an eating disorder thinking it's going to make them faster. Next up, we're going to look at the correlation between your racing speed and the value of your bike. Now, let's be honest, we're triathletes, we all like nice bikes, okay? None of us are going to be really happy on just a £500 road bike. We're all going to look at people who go past us on these fancy Swish TT bikes and go, oh, you know what, I wish I had one of them. But I'll be honest, and this may come across as arrogant, and I apologise if it does, but if you were to put me on an entry-level road bike, maybe with a pair of clip-on bars on, I reckon I could go faster in a sprint triathlon than, about, let's say, 2/3 of people on really expensive TT bikes. Now, you may think, oh no, that's nonsense. There's no way that would work. Well, let's look at why people really like lighter, more expensive bikes, okay? And we all do. Now, if we have never really been road cycling before, if we have a mountain bike in the shed that we bring out when we start triathlon training, and the tyres are quite cracked and worn, they're very low on pressure, you have to pump them right up, and the bike itself is really quite heavy, it probably doesn't fit us very well, and we take this out on the road and we're making it work, okay? It's not the best bike, we know that. But as we go up and as we're clunkily changing through gears and it skips and stops, we're getting frustrated. We think, no, you know what? I need to get a proper bike. So we go down a bike shop and say, look, I haven't got loads of money, but I'm looking to get a road bike. And when you go from that bag of nails special to that first road bike, where you have smooth tyres that are much narrower, where you have gears that change a lot easier, where we are probably looking at being, 2, maybe even 3 or 4 kilos lighter than that kind of Halford special that we had in the shed. That is going to feel like absolutely night and day. You're going to be going so much faster. But we then go out and we ride our bike around, and we get to riding up the local hills that we finally are able to ride up easier because the gearing is better and the bike is lighter. And then we still see people fly past us, and we see them go by on Canyons and Pinarellos and Cervelos and all these bikes that cost probably more than your car. And you look at it and you go, oh, my bike just isn't good enough. I need to get a lighter bike. That's what's wrong. Let me stop you right there, okay? The people who are overtaking you on the hills with those super bikes, they're just fitter than you. Yeah, their bike might be 1 or 2 kilos lighter than yours between the frame and the wheels. But the reason they're absolutely smashing it up the hill is because they've just been riding their bikes for years. They've been really diligent with their training. They've been really consistent. The benefit is really coming from the rider more than it is from the value of the bike, I'm afraid to say. Now, you may say, yeah, but what about aerodynamics? Aero is everything. I really need to get more aerodynamic that will make you faster. Yeah, I totally agree. In triathlon, you'd be a bit of a fool not to take some clip-on aero bars. However, the aerodynamic position that you get yourself into is far more important than the frame itself. If you give me a road bike and a pair of clip-on bars, I can get really, really close to the position that I'm in on my expensive TT bike that I own. I mean, it's not crazy expensive. It was worth about £3,000 when I bought it. But still, it's a really solid bike. But the difference between that bike and a cheap road bike with clip-on aero bars is probably not as massive as people would think. Getting your body into that narrow, leaning forward position is where 90% of the aero gains are going to come from. Looking at my TT bike, yes, I've got an aero-optimized seat post. I have a base bar that is carbon fibre and aero-optimized. The frame itself is tapered. I've got all these little nicks and tucks because triathlon is really important to me. But the reality is, it's much more about the legs, it's much more about the engine than it is the bike that you're riding on. Now, I'm not telling you that you can't spend a lot of money on your bike. It's none of my business how you spend your money. But rather than saying, hey, I'm going to drop 10 grand on this absolute top of the line bike because I've got the money and this triathlon is really important to me, no, you can do that. Or you could say, you know what, I'm actually going to spend a bit less on the bike, but I'm also going to get some really nice aerodynamic race wheels. I'm going to get myself an aero helmet. And you know what? Maybe I'm going to hire a coach like Simon who might actually be able to help me ride the bike fast. I overtake so many people in triathlons who have these really nice bikes that I go flying past on a bike that's worth a fraction of theirs. And these are people who, more often than not, you'll see posted after one event, the bike for sale in a triathlon Facebook group. They're going, sport wasn't what I thought it was, I'm selling up. And they're selling that bike at a huge loss. So, again, if you want to spend a lot of money on your bike, far be it for me to stop you. But I generally recommend somebody races for at least a year before they get a time trial bike or triathlon bike. And that they definitely leave it a long time in the sport before they start looking at the really top end stuff. Okay, on to myth 4 out of 5. We're getting through them now. Is whether strength training is going to make you really big, bulky, and slow. Now, this is a really common misconception that people have. Is that if they go into the weight room, they're going to start looking like the average gym goer, and that's going to make them really slow. Now, I'm going to be honest, yeah, if you took your average bodybuilder out of the gym and asked them to do a triathlon, they probably wouldn't do very well. A, because they're not very aerobically fit at all, but yeah, because they have a lot of muscle mass which isn't really overly functional. Okay, they've got this big chest, they've got big arms, things that we don't necessarily need for triathlon. However, the thought that you could accidentally get massive in the gym by doing a few strength exercises is really wide of the mark. And in fact, I saw a bodybuilder make a post about this the other day, which really, put it into perspective. It's somebody saying, do you really think that you could accidentally achieve what I spend most of my life really striving to achieve? Because building muscle is hard. Your body doesn't want to build muscle, because by building muscle, it is increasing its base metabolic rate, which is the amount of energy that it needs to survive day to day. People say that just having muscle burns fat. Well, the reason for that is that the body has to, divert a certain number of calories to each gram of muscle each day to stop that muscle from wasting away. So your body is saying, but I don't really want to build muscle, because if there's a famine, that's going to make us more, prone to starvation. Now, in the world that we live in, not many of us are going to be prone to famines. But your body still doesn't want to build that muscle. Strength, I was happy to build strength. But the actual bulk, the size of the muscle, much less so. Now, if I were to write somebody a bodybuilding program, if somebody came to me and said, Simon, I want to get really big, the first thing I'd say is, find yourself another coach. But if they're insistent on hiring me for whatever reason, or I had to do it, we go, all right, so what we need to do is we need to lift somewhere between the kind of 5 to 8 reps per set is the usual range that a lot of bodybuilders would go for. Some will go much more volume. They'll go closer to sort of 12, 15, maybe more. There's different schools of thought surrounding it. But most of them will lift a different rep range to us because they're looking to sort of trigger a different kind of adaptation. And additionally, they're going to want to make sure they're in a relatively decent calorie surplus every day. The reason being is that after they break down the muscles of all of their training, that they then go to sleep at night and the body goes, oh, our muscles were really pushed their limit today. Let's build them back stronger. Oh, look at all this carbohydrate and protein we have available. Yes, we can use that to build our muscles up. Now, if you're training for triathlon, yes, you do need to make sure that you have a good amount of carbohydrate and a good amount of protein available to you when you go to sleep so that we adapt our exercise. But it won't be in the same quantity as a bodybuilder will have, and we won't have been battering those same muscle groups day after day, week after week, month after month, really triggering those responses. If we are lifting once or twice a week, which is what most triathletes will do, they'll either do 12 reps of relatively lightweight, or they'll do 3 or 4 reps of a really heavy weight. That's where most triathletes are going to be lifting, either in that maintenance or adaptation phase or in that max strength phase. The body is much less likely to say, hey, let's build a ton of muscle. However, there may be a few of you there going, well, hang on a minute, like, if I'm spending all this time squatting in the gym, I mean, it might be nice to see something from all that. And yeah, you will. You will see a bit of toning, okay? You'll see a bit of definition. But what you're not going to see is you're not going to see yourself put on several kilos of muscle mass and start looking like a bodybuilder on a stage just from doing a few bits of strength exercising. And I know a number of women are very self-conscious about this, especially. They'll see images of female bodybuilders on stage and go, my God, I cannot think of anything worse. To reassure you, most bodybuilders, for 99.5% of their lives, they look strong, but they don't look anything like those on a stage. When somebody is on a stage during a bodybuilding competition, not only have they drunk a huge amount of water to get themselves like that, they've also gone through a lot of probably sauna preparation. Their body is in a very unnatural state that can only be maintained for a very short period of time. Okay, so yeah, you may see those images of bodybuilders and go, yikes, like that's not for me. Don't worry, unless you go through a really meticulous phase of bulking and cutting and getting ready for show weight, you're never going to look anything like that. Now, the final myth that I'm going to address today is whether you need to have as much salt as you can for your triathlon race. Now, replacing electrolytes is super important. It can be really important for performance as well as aiding digestion, your muscles. There's lots of reasons that we need to replace salt as we're training, especially in warm conditions where we're sweating large amounts, losing lots of fluid, losing lots of salt, and not replacing any salt through the gels and the bars that we're having. We do really need to make sure that we're taking on some form of electrolytes. Now, before we get into this, I want to cast your mind back to Casino Royale, okay, the James Bond film. I'm sure a lot of you have seen that. Now, you may remember there's a scene where Daniel Craig is sat at the table and he realises that he's been poisoned. And he stands up and he sort of staggers off to the men's room, grabbing a handful of salt sachets on the way. He staggers into the toilet fills up a glass of water, and he decamps all of this salt that he can into the water. And he chugs the water down, and that immediately makes him run to the bathroom stall where he throws up. Okay? Because he wants to get the poison out of his body. That is the way to get yourself to throw up, is to have loads of salt. So, if we are then going into a triathlon where we are pushing our body hard, where we may already be experiencing a low level of nausea in some cases if we're nailing all of these gels, if we then throw a load of salt down us as well, that's going to really upset our GI tract. Now, a lot of companies out there will talk about how you may need to take on more salt than other people, and they're absolutely right, okay? Those of us who have a really high sweat rate, those of us who are very salty sweaters, such as myself, I really don't sweat very much when I'm training. But I remember finishing my first London Marathon and being absolutely covered in salt crystals. When I got a sweat test, which I know isn't an exact science, it came back and it said, look, your sweat is really salty. So I now know that I need to replace a lot of salt in my racing. And it's really improved my performance over 70.3 in Ironman since I've realised how much beneficial that can be for me to take an extra level of salt. If you were to get your average off-the-shelf electrolyte supplement that may only contain maybe a third of what some people need to consume. But with what gets lost in kind of the nuance, and a lot of these supplement companies, they want to sell you products which are going to solve a problem. And by one of the downsides of them banging this drum about how important it is to replace salt is that some people who don't need to be taking on a huge amount of salt are taking on more than they need. And as a result, this can actually have a really negative effect on their race. So my recommendation with this, as with anything when it comes to race day nutrition, is practice in your training. I know if you are booked to go out and race Kona, you cannot replicate the conditions of Kona whilst training in pretty much anywhere else in the world, let's be honest. But don't try something new for the first time on race day if you haven't really practiced it. Don't get lulled into, I've read how important it is to replace salt, so I'm going to take one salt capsule every 30 minutes in addition to everything else that I normally take on. That is really going to hurt your racing, okay? Go out there, try taking, using some of the products out there that have higher levels of electrolytes in them, see how it feels, see how it affects your training. And start increasing that salt level, maybe, see how it feels, and you'll probably get to a point where you feel that it's actually having a negative impact on your training. And you need to remember that. You need to go, okay, I need to drop down from here, maybe that's what I need. And on your longer runs, on your longer rides, to practice taking on this level of electrolyte long before you make a decision on how much you're going to take on race day. So there we have it, 5 triathlon myths debunked. I hope they help save you money, develop a better relationship with your training, and race faster. That's all from me for this week. I'll be back next week with another guest and an interview. Thank you for listening. I really hope you found the episode useful and interesting. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. If you'd like to come on the podcast and share your triathlon story, send an email to the address in the show notes. We'll organise a conversation, see if we can work something out. Until next time, good luck with your training and stay safe.